Alright, welcome back to the coding tutorials for SkillAPI. Last time we set up our project and the base classes for a class, a skill, and the actual plugin. In this tutorial we'll be actually creating effects for our skill to make it actually do something. Alright, so we have the skill and we want to make it a target skill. Something that you look at an enemy, you cast a skill, and it works on that enemy. So, for that, you want to come up to the top of the class where you're extending class skill, and then also implement a target skill. Now this is one of the interfaces SkillAPI provides that pretty much provides the functionality that we want, where you can cast it while looking at an enemy to cast it on that enemy. How it does this is it provides you a method, so I'll implement that right now, that gives you the player that cast it, the entity that you're targeting, the level of the skill, and whether or not the target is an ally. So I'm just going to rename these just for keeping it simple, so we don't have random names. And then once you have this method, you can basically put what you want to happen inside the method. Now I'm just commenting everything just out of habit. Now, this method also has a return type of Boolean. If you return true, that means you cast the skill successfully, so it will put it on cooldown and use up the mana. If you return false, that means that you weren't able to cast a skill for some reason, whether the person didn't have the correct item that was needed, or if it wasn't supposed to be an ally, or anything like that. So like for the start of this, we don't want to be damaging allies, so we'll say if it's an ally, then just return false. Because we're not targeting allies. So, since we took care of that, so now it'll only be enemy targets. Now, we want to be dealing damage. So, one value that we want is how much damage do we want to do. Now with SkillAPI, you can turn that into an attribute. These attributes show up in the skill description so that players can see what sort of damage they're dealing. Now the way I like to do this is I go up with the name constant, and I make another constant of that value. So we're dealing damage, so let's name it damage. Now exactly how you put it in here will be what's shown in the skill description, like in skill trees. Then once you have the name of it, then in the constructor you can set a base value for it. So how you do this is you use the method setAttribute. You provide the name, you provide the starting value, so what it is at level 1 of the skill. So let's say we want this to start off at, like, let's say 5 damage. Then the last value is how much it gains per level. Let's say it increases by 1 damage per level. Alright, so now we have our damage attribute. So now down here we can get it. So these are double values, so you can do double damage equals, then you use get attribute. You just provide the name along with the level of the skill. Level is provided in the method header, so you don't even need to retrieve that. You just add in level. So now that you have the damage you're going to deal, now you can just damage the target. So target.damage the damage we just got, and then the source of it is the player. Alright, so now the target's damaged. So that would be all that's needed to create a damaging skill. Like just normal damage. But now let's say we knock him back a little bit. Now this does a little bit of vector usages. So if you're not too familiar with this, you might have to look up some tutorials on this as well. But basically, to get the direction that you want to go, if you want to push the target away, you do the target's position minus your own position. So target.get location dot subtract player.get location. Now since we're doing velocity, to make him move, you want to do toVector, since velocities use vectors. Alright, once you have that, now you want to set it to a certain speed. Now this could be another attribute that we have, so how fast do you want to knock him back? So along with damage, I'll add speed up here, and set it along with damage in the constructor. For the speed, let's set it to something, let's say 2 and increase by half every level. Alright, and going back down here, we can get the speed again, so double speed equals get attribute speed at the level. Now to set the speed for the velocity, do velocity dot multiply the speed over the velocity's length. The reason for this is to normalize. You can also just normalize it first and then multiply by speed. But to do it in one line, I just divide by the length, because that's basically normalizing it. And normalizing is just setting the length to 1, so a speed of 1. Because if you set the speed to 1 and then multiply by your speed, it'll end up being the speed. Alright, so once we have the speed set, we can just set the velocity of the target. So target.set velocity, velocity. Alright, and that should knock it back. Now, that would just be the relative line to the target, but let's say they're above or below you. There'll also be a y value, and that would make things a little different. For some reason, I've found out that the y velocity is much more sensitive than the x or z. So what I tend to do is, after I set the speed, I'll multiply or take the y, and I'll set it to 1/5 of it, and then I'll tend to add like a decimal, like 0.5, just to make them go over the ground a little bit easier. Now this is what I just did to help balance it out, to make it seem nicer when pushing things away, but you can do it however you want. That would be my recommendation though. So taking the y velocity, dividing it by 5, and adding 0.5. Okay, so that's all the effects we want, and once we've done all that, we've successfully cast the skill, so then we can return true, saying, yes, we cast the skill, you can put it on cooldown and use the mana now. So, it's supposed to go on cooldown and use the mana, but in order to know how much it does, you need to set those attributes as well. Now, this is done very similarly to how we did the damage and the speed, except the attribute names are already provided for us. So, you set attribute again, but now there's a class called SkillAPI, and that contains a bunch of default attributes that you can use, such as cooldown. So, SkillATtribute.cooldown would be, what is the cooldown on the skill? This is a fairly lower tier skill, I would think, so to give it a lower cooldown, let's say 5 seconds. And then there's another one for mana. Now, cooldown and mana would only be used on active skills, ones that you would cast. Passive skills, you don't need these two. but since this is an active skill, you would add these in. But for the amount of mana we want to use, let's say, let's use about 5. Yeah, let's make it 10. 10 mana. Alright, there's a few other attributes that you can set for skills as well. One of them is the level requirement, so skill attribute.level. This is how high the player needs to be in terms of level in order to use the skill. Again, this is a basic skill, so let's make it start at level 1. Another option is the cost, the skill point cost. How many skill points are required to upgrade the skill? I generally keep this at one skill point plus 0 per level, just to keep it fairly easy to unlock it, especially with the default 1 skill point per level. And then there's a 5th one that's only for target skills such as this, and that is the range. Now the range is how far away the target can be when targeting it. So if it's supposed to be a very short range one, you will want to keep this low. Normally targets, like in Minecraft, when you're targeting a button or just like left clicking on it with an auto attack, it's generally about 6 range to give you a reference. So for a slam, let's say it's a more close quarters one, so let's give it a range of 4. Alright, those are all of the built-in attributes that you can use. Again, cooldown and mana are not used in passive skills, only used in active skills. And then range is only used in target skills. Alright, so now you have the effects, you have all of the attributes. Now there's just one last thing. You want to give the player a description of your skill, like what exactly does it do, so they know what they're investing in when they spend points on it. Now to give it a description, in the constructor again, just below the attributes if you want, that's generally where I put it, you just type description dot add, and then you type in a line. So say deals damage and knocks. Now if you want to put it in separate lines, just do it again. Just move down to the next line, do description dot add again. Generally, I limit it to about 4 to 5 words per line. Depends on the length of words, obviously, but generally don't keep it much longer than the attribute line length. Unless I have a longer description, then I just try to limit it to about 5 lines in the description. How much you put on each line is up to you, what you feel comfortable with, what looks right. But that's how you set the description. So once you have that, your skill's complete. You now have a damaging skill that knocks back enemies and has a description with all the configurable attributes that it needs. And since we already set it up with the class and the plugin, it's all ready to go and can be put into the game and usable as is. So that's adding the effects for a skill. I'll go over more of the different ways to add effects, such as the different interfaces that are available in the next tutorial. So thanks for watching, and I hope this helped.